You're listening to Speaking Sidemount, the podcast where we talk all things sidemount diving, from equipment, skills, techniques, and sidemount diving expeditions to interviews with some of the world's top sidemount divers. Whether you're new to sidemount, been sidemount diving for years, or just want to know more, this is the place for all things sidemount. I'm your host, Steve Davis. Let's get wet. Hey, welcome back to Speaking Sidemount. I'm Steve Davis. This episode is brought to you by our brilliant sponsor XDEEP and by the patrons of Speaking Sidemount. Huge thanks to both for their support that makes everything you're about to listen to possible. Speaking of XDEEP, I know that I'm not the only one mesmerized at the moment by the teasers of the Sidewinder 2 being released by KISS Rebreathers from the boot show in Germany. Now, I've known for some time now, and more particularly when I caught up with Patrick Widmann in November, that this was going to literally be a stellar upgrade to the Sidewinder, and to be honest, to KISS Rebreathers and rebreathers in general. The word revolutionary gets bandied around a little bit too much, but it's hard not to be impressed by the scope and detail of what's being teased to us right now. I can see that this is driving some of you crazy with a litany of detailed questions on the Facebook posts. It's a teaser, folks. The detail comes later, but a quick overview of the changes, ranging from patented innovations to the canisters, the overpressure valve, the automated diluent valve, completely waterproof cells, and fixes to some of the weaknesses of the Sidewinder, such as new stainless steel ports, means that this is really an amazing effort. Add to that the system upgrades are modular and able to be fitted to the current Sidewinder, and my mind is literally blown. I think the hardest thing will be deciding on what to fit in a modular sense to my current Sidewinder, or do you just say, stuff it, take my money and give me a new Sidewinder? Time will tell, but I can't wait to hear and see more. So on with this episode. I'm still coming down from my nearly 3 weeks in Mexico last November. I went primarily to train with Patrick Widmann, the co-owner of ProTec Dive Centers and the training director for KISS Rebreathers, along with the many other things this amazing guy does. I went to do the KISS Sidewinder 60-meter course, often called the Mod 2, and also to do the CCR Full Cave Diver course. I had good reasons for wanting to do both courses to continue my own development as a diver. You'll know from the many conversations that I've had on the Sidewinder on Speaking Sidemount that I chose this tool both as my cave rebreather and also as a rebreather that I could use to dive shipwrecks and deeper open water dives. It's my opinion that it's the best tool for both cave and wreck penetration diving, primarily due to its tight profile and robustness. Open water is a bit of a push, but as I dive more on boats, I'm developing my techniques for entries and exits and figuring out how to manage the width of the Sidewinder on boat decks. Now, I chose Patrick as my instructor for obvious reasons, but I'll share them anyway. I did my air diluent Sidewinder course with Ed Sorensen, and as you've heard me say, it was absolutely brilliant. I learned so much, and Ed is a phenomenal diver, instructor, and a really good guy to hang with. His stories are epic to say the least. But I've always wanted to have the broadest possible experience base, and that includes learning from a range of really good instructors. It was a no-brainer in that sense to go to Patrick and see what he'd been working on for KISS training and gain from his experience and skill set, which, to be honest, is immense. From being near motionless in 2 meters of water doing no-fin skills, to his tight and on-point skill processes for cave drills, to his CCR weighting, which makes it way easier to hold shallow stops on a rebreather, to the ratio deco strategies we use to recalculate our deco on the fly. It was all amazing. Now, in trying to explain the experience to people, I say it was like taking tennis lessons from Roger Federer. Now, at ProTec, Kim and Patrick have been for many years developing the next generation of world-class instructors. I've had Skander Caulfield on the show twice, and in this episode, I'm really pleased to introduce to you Jake Bulman. Jake's been at ProTec for 5 years now and has literally become Patrick's understudy, teaching cave diving, the KISS Sidewinder courses, Cave CCR, and soon the Sidewinder 60-meter course. He's renowned as a consummate instructor and absolute master of no-fins training in particular. Now, given we met, albeit briefly in November, I took the opportunity to get Jake on the show to talk about his diving, how he teaches, and in particular some of the details around my Cave CCR and Sidewinder Mod 2 course that were, let's say, surprising to me and fundamental to the way that ProTec teaches these courses. All this and much more on this episode of Speaking Sidemount. Jake, welcome to Speaking Sidemount.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Cool. It's awesome to see you again, mate. I mean, we met for the first time in November when we bumped into each other at the dive center at ProTec in Playa. And I didn't get the opportunity to dive with you, which was a great disappointment, nor did we get to hang out that much either. So this is a pretty cool opportunity for us to get to know each other a little better as well. I heard so much about you both beforehand and also while I was there. We're going to get into some of that as well, so I'm pretty excited about that. But let's get started by getting to tell a little bit about yourself.
Coming from Canada, I grew up with the water my whole life, so diving just really fit in. I pretty quickly saw people doing cooler things, as I think most people have had a similar experience. You want to go a little bit deeper, a little bit further. And then one of my friends said Mexico is the place to be, and he moved out of the place that we were diving in from. And then I did some research and said, yeah, that seems like the place to go. ProTec was the one that stood out to me, so I just showed up at ProTec the day that I landed in Mexico and had a very long conversation with Patrick. And then it's been here 5 years now.
Wow. So tell me about the diving you were doing. Where are you from in Canada?
Definitely not a place that has any diving. I'm from Winnipeg, which is right in the middle of Canada. We have not great access to water. However, I would always spend my summers a little bit further east of there, where we have a cottage and spending on the lake. And my job was actually teaching swimming. So I spent my whole life around the water. Then diving really didn't come in until actually after high school. I did an open water class with my mom because it seemed like something we could do together. And then I just decided I was going to jump in with both feet. And I moved down to Honduras, where I really had no experience, but I really enjoyed the community down there. And I got to dive every day. And I went from pretty much no diving experience to doing deeper diving, rebreather diving a little bit, and then doing a bit of teaching, which was all really good experience. And then outside of diving, it was also just a really good life experience getting to go meet so many people from such a vast array of walks of life, which is really quite awesome about the diving community. Then I actually did my cave training in Florida because I wanted to do a class on the KISS Sidekick. And my goal was actually to do a trimix class, but the guy said that in order to do a trimix class, those sites are all overhead. So I said, okay, I'll do cave class then, I guess, and did my cave class on the rebreather, did my trimix training, and then decided that, cave diving is actually what I took from this that I really enjoyed, not so much the deep diving at the time. And then Mexico seemed like a better fit for me, so moved here.
And tell me about the conversation with Patrick, because that sounds really interesting. So when you turned up there, how did you sell ProTec on they should take on this dude from Canada who's trained in Honduras and Florida and probably hadn't dived much in Mexico at that stage?
I had 0 dives in Mexico at that point. I literally landed on the bus and I had a 3-hour wait for my luggage to arrive. So I just walked over to ProTec in the clothes that I had been traveling in all day. So likely didn't look the most presentable, but Patrick just happened to be sitting in the classroom working on the computer. Actually, he was on the phone at the time. And I had emailed them months back. And I honestly don't know if he remembered the email or not, because I actually had interacted with the other owners more. And then he sat me down and asked me about my experience, asked me what I can offer to ProTec, what ProTec can offer me in terms of if I were to work there. Was very helpful, very supportive, but also very clear that while I may be an experienced diver in the world that I was coming from, I was not a particularly experienced diver in the world that I was trying to enter. And it was done in a nice way, but I also left with a very clear understanding of where my position was at that time. So he gave me some piece of advice, namely going to go just dive. So it took me probably 4 or 5 months to really get myself situated in Mexico between a truck and a working visa and, learning the system, finding a place. So I dove as much as I could for those 5 or 6 months, which ended up leading to a stage class with him where he offered me a job at the end of it, which was really good because after 5 or 6 months of not working, a job is pretty needed.
Yeah. And I've had a similar experience. I did my instructor training with Tom Steiner and got offered a job at the end of instructor training and some cave training, etc. with him. But you've certainly got to impress the person you're training with. and I've trained with Patrick, so I know what that's like. You must have done a good job.
I actually really don't remember it, but I guess I did. I remember being very nervous for it. And actually, I decided I was going to bring my own tanks for that class because I had been using my tanks every day. And he said, yeah, sure, no problem. Just make sure they're full. And to this day, I don't know how they were not full, but we got to the dive site and they were all empty. So that was not great. It was not a great start.
Yeah, and I want to talk a lot about working at ProTec and my experience there, and I'll weave in kind of what I went through in November, because as many will know, I was there for 3.5 weeks diving with Patrick for 11 days straight, or training for 11 days straight, which was an experience in itself. I so enjoyed the experience. And here's the things that stick with me, having spent my time with you guys. The first thing was the immense professionalism that you all displayed. And I don't mean that in a sense of instructing and in the water. I mean that in the sense of everything, turning up on time, being in the center, working with your students, working with each other. It just oozed professionalism, and I was so impressed with, it wasn't just what I saw of you, it was also what I saw of Steve Crosby and Maria and Tamara and Kim when I saw him there, and certainly with Patrick as well. I think the thing that sticks out to me is there's levels in this game, just like there's levels in everything else. I told the story many, many times about tennis. I took my kids when they were young to learn tennis in Australia. We were living in Queensland. They went along to a school that was Pat Rafter's coach. Gary Stickler ran the school, and the coaches there were phenomenal, great teachers. And I remember thinking, gee, they're good tennis players. And then Scott Draper came, who was on the ATP tour at the time. He was a Davis Cup player for Australia, and he played them and donutted them. So these great tennis players, in my mind, just played someone who was on the tour. It was just immense. And then Scott played Pat Rafter, who was number one in the world, not long after that, and didn't do very well. So there was this kind of, here's number one in the world, here's a player on the tour, and then here's your club coach who you look at and think is a great player. And it just came to me, there's levels in this game. And I think the same thing applies obviously to diving. And there's a lot of people like me around who are really good side mount divers. We can dive well, and we can accomplish dives, we can cave dive, we can do decompression dives and so on. But there's levels. And it was just so interesting to me to come into, as you said, when you arrived at ProTec and Patrick gave you that discussion about this is the level you're coming to here. And it's so evident in what you guys do and in the training I took. I was so impressed. And I should have done this episode before I paid you guys, actually, now that I'm thinking about it, because I'm a big fanboy now. And Patrick didn't miss me, by the way, but it was still a really, really good experience. And I loved every moment of it. So congrats to you and the whole team there. Why don't we weave in some things here about what you guys do now and perhaps start at the beginning? I mean, I've spent a lot of time on Speaking Sidemount talking about being still and what I call relaxed static stability, and I do own that term. I think we'd all agree that being still in the water is the foundation of all good diving, and certainly required for cave diving. Now, when I trained with Patrick, we spent some time in the early dives around the checkout dives doing no fins practice. And I hadn't done it before. I'd seen it, but I hadn't done it. And Patrick and others have passed on to me that you're an absolute master of no fins practice. So can you share with me a little bit about no fins practice and how it helps your diving?
Sure. I had the same experience as you did, where you do it for the first time and it's not something that has even really been considered in your life as like something that is worth practicing or even something that people do. And while obviously it's not a realistic scenario, you're not going to go diving with no fins, it does train a set of skills that is really essential to diving, as you said. And what's so great about it is that it just removes your ability to use your fin for stability. And we don't really understand how much we rely on our fins for stability. And then when we take them off, it's very clear how much they actually help. It's similar to like training wheels on a bike, except in this case, we spend our whole diving lives with our training wheels on. And that's just the normal way we dive. But once the fins come off, you really, really learn how to use your core, your breathing, maybe not so much with the rebreather, but everything that's not your fins, or especially your hands, for stability. And then once you put the fins back on and you go and do your day-to-day diving, it really feels very much easy, like you have your training wheels on again. And as you said, the importance of stability is really hard to measure. It gives you the ability to be aware. It gives you the ability to focus on other things. The list is endless with that. But no fins is something that I suggest to almost everybody. I do it in every single class. And when people ask me, what should I be practicing? It's almost always my first answer because it is just so effective.
Yeah, I learned that. One thing I battled with a little bit was when I turned up, my Sidewinder setup got changed dramatically, which was all for the better. But I remember coming back to the dive center, telling you about my experience and saying that my actual Sidewinder was not balanced. So it was heavy on the right side because of the valve and regulator. And I really struggled. I felt like I struggled fighting my equipment, and I always sought in my diving to go, okay, get your equipment balanced so that you don't have to fight your equipment. And then from there, put it in the water and then learn how to dive with it. And Patrick was really emphasizing to me that I should be able to address that imbalance with body control. And I made some progress on that, but I think there's a way for me to go if I found myself in an imbalanced situation. So talk me through that. Help me explain a little more where he was going with this body control core. He talks about hips a lot in that as well, so that it helps you if through your dive, for instance, let's say you've used gas on one side or another or something else is going on, you happen to be imbalanced.
Well, the actual specific movements that people do tends to vary from the person. It actually really, if you think back to it, it's really hard to quite describe the actual little movements that happen. What tends to happen when people start practicing it is they kind of build a connection with these muscles and they learn, if I make this small little movement or that's put a little bit of tension there, how it changes their trim, how it changes their position, how it changes the way gas moves in their dry suit. And the more time you spend linking this movement with that effect, this movement with that effect, the more you're able to just deal with a little bit of instability. Now, as you said, having equipment that is inherently stable is definitely a goal to work towards. But unfortunately, when you just go diving in different situations, imbalances happen. The easiest example is a stage tank, right? And I think most people had a similar experience where the first time you put on a stage tank, you think, wow, how do people do this as you roll over to the side? And now you do 10, 20, 30, 100 plus dives, and you look back and think, well, that was a non-issue now. But at the time, it felt really quite difficult. While nothing changed with your equipment, a lot has changed with the way that you connect with the different muscles and how your body moves. And then it doesn't feel like a problem anymore.
Yeah. So while I didn't get it 100%, I'll say that for sure, certainly on the first couple of days, I did make some changes, balanced my equipment out, and it got better and better. But I remember the same thing when I first did my stage and decompression training was when you're carrying not 4, but 3, you always felt like you were heavy to the left. And I remember using a trim weight to begin with to trim it out. But of course, that only works as long as you don't breathe the gas on that side, right? As soon as you breathe that gas, then the trim weight is actually finding you the other way. And I know for a fact now when I dive 3 cylinders, I never feel it. So I think you're preaching to the converted there, and I do understand that. And I hope that'll help me understand the rest of it in terms of getting that feel, and I'll certainly do some more practice of that. And I think one thing that's kind of related to that is the limited amount of weight that you guys dive with, because you do dive with absolute minimum weight. And on the rebreather, we're actually using our gas weight as ballast as well, right? Which is quite different to the way that I've always done it before. I've always done my weighting, get your cylinders down to 50 bar, 30 bar, weight yourself to that at the end of the dive, because that's where you potentially will get. And there is an argument if you had to bail out, you could be there, right? But you're not doing that. And I found that so interesting. And I guess it's also a bit controversial doing this. So I'd be really interested on you talking that through a little bit and saying, okay, especially with rebreathers, I don't think this is the case with open circuit, is it?
No.
Okay. Let's let you explain it from the beginning about how you do a weighting with a rebreather and why you do it that way.
Sure. As you said, we include the weight of the gas in the cylinders as part of our weight. And also, as you said, it is a pretty controversial thing, which in the basic class, the Mod 1 class, the air diluing class, there's a whole hour and 15-minute presentation about why we do this and the pros and cons to it. So to put it in short is, one, when we explain to people, we do give them the option. Like, we don't say you have to do it this way. We explain that this is one way, this is the other. And we do make a case for the way that we believe. And that case is really that having less weight for your day-to-day, everyday diving means that you have a whole lot less gas in the overall system, which means that every time you have a depth change, the change happens slower. You have to make a less drastic response to it. And there's a lot of benefit in that. When someone is paying a lot of attention or a lot of energy or awareness to just trying to stay neutral, while we think of that as just basic diving skills, it also costs them in the sense of how much awareness are they paying to something else? What are they missing? What are they not able to catch from a team environment or a team point of view, an environment point of view, whether that's open water or Mod 2 as you did, or cave diving. And the way that we see it is that the gained awareness from having diving that is substantially easier with less gas inherently makes us safer than being able to bail out and then having the ability to drain our tanks to zero and still be neutral. Now, of course, we need to plan to be able to bail out. And the difference that is made there is with the Sidewinder and having very little pieces that are difficult to replace or expensive to replace or even really breakable by water. If that day comes, which it very well might for somebody, and for many people it does, where you have to bail out, you can always fledge a rebreather. Reality is the most likely scenario is that you're bailing out because of flooding in the first place, in which case you're heavy. The other possible scenarios are you're just generally uncomfortable, or you have CO2, or you have electronics failures. If I had to bail out an open circuit and exit to the point that I would drain my entire cylinder, which means I'm bailing out at maximum point of penetration, when the moment came that I was becoming too light, I would let water into my rebreather, and it makes a substantial difference in weight, and I would be able to make it out. And I have done that, actually. The other point of that is we have a team. Now, while you cannot rely on your team to give you weight or give you gas, they can give you gas, and that does help with your weight. They're effectively giving you weight by sharing gas. So you're absolutely right. It is controversial, but just from the sheer amount of students that have come through and the difference in performance between watching someone struggle with buoyancy for a week and then watching someone struggle a little bit at the very beginning, maybe, but then really quite quickly getting it. The level of diver that we're able to create from an understanding point of view and an awareness point of view, when I look at the two, and I've done both, I really feel more comfortable with the person who develops this understanding and awareness and all of the other art part of diving a rebreather, as opposed to just spending a week practicing buoyancy.
Yes, it's so interesting. And I've got a couple of, I guess from my point of view, a couple of responses having been through the experience. And also I've got a bailout story as well, which is pretty cool. So the first thing was that when I turned up to Patrick and I sort of discussed with him what I was looking to achieve from the training with him, I was pretty comfortable on the Sidewinder. I had 120 odd hours and had done a fair amount of diving, including cave diving. But the area you always struggle is in that 6 meter and less area, you know, so I'm super comfortable through the entire dive. And yet when I get to 6 meters and I'm holding a 6 meter stop or a 3 meter stop, whatever it is, I felt like it was a battle the entire time. So could I do it? Yes, I could. But I was adding gas, dumping gas, adding gas, dumping gas, adding gas, dumping gas. Of course, if you're decompressing, you've got gas coming into the loop. So I'm getting gas out of the loop. It's anyone's guess how much you need to get out over a period of time, and you learn that with experience. But it was certainly the most challenging part of my diving was in that sub 6 meter area. My question was, how do you guys do it? And this is absolutely the answer. So I thought, okay, cool. And I thought about it from a cave diving perspective. And I thought, well, yeah, why not? I mean, we did a fair bit of grabbing rocks along the way in caves as well and stuffing a rock into our rig, not least of which because in many of the caves you're going through heliclines where you're hitting saltwater layers and becoming quite a bit more buoyant as well. And so there was a fair amount of, my buoyancy not only is changing due to depth, but it's also changing due to the density of the water that we're diving in. And that's an option in the cave, isn't it? You grab a rock, stuff it in yourself, and next thing you know, you've got a bit of ballast. So that's an option, I think, for cave diving. I mentioned that I had a bailout experience, and this was on a dive at Monkey Dust. And as I'm sure you know, the average depth of that dive was less than 6 meters or so. And we were diving to the second tee. I don't remember the exact route now, but we had 2 tees here. That might tell you where I was. So we were about 45 minutes into the cave. And stupidly, I trusted my computer in terms of the battery level indicator, and it was showing half when I checked it in the morning and half when I got to the dive site. I didn't check the voltage, so that was a mistake on my part. However, not even 2 minutes, 1 minute from the second tee, it started flashing red. I didn't even see a yellow, so I don't know if it went through that. And then within 30 seconds of that, the computer completely failed. And I often dive with a nerd in addition to my petrol. I didn't have that on. I'd taken it off for training just to get it out of the way. And so I had no way of knowing my PPO2. So communicated with Steve, who was my guide, and Mark was with me as well. Decided to bail out. Decided that I didn't feel like I wanted to go SCR because we had a 45-minute swim out and I had tons of gas. So we turned the dive, swam out, happy days, and side mount, no issues at all. I was pretty keen to carry on with the dive, by the way, too, which Steve and I had a little discussion underwater about, because as far as I was concerned, I was a side mount diver with plenty of gas at that point. But Steve was thinking in the back of his mind, quite rightly, if something went wrong, how would he write this incident report up? We bailed out and then carried on with the dive. So he made a good decision. I was happy either way. Anyhow, so we swam back and I got out of the water and had the great privilege of carrying their tanks back to the car. So that was my workout of the day. But I had a bit of a chance to think about it. And the first thing about that dive was that I was incredibly comfortable on the Sidewinder in 6 meters or less for the 45 minutes that I got out to that point. And incidentally, the next dive we did after that was with Maria Nahoch. That's even shallower. And again, we did a 3-hour dive at probably 5 meters average depth. And again, without any issue whatsoever. So there's certainly a case if you're diving shallow or when you're in shallow water, this makes your diving so much easier. I think the challenges might come when you're open water. But look, again, the same thing applies when you come to your 6 meter stop. How do you want to feel? So I think I will dive with a lot less weight. For most of my time there, I didn't have my BCD connected anyhow. I think when I go back to open water, I probably will. But it was certainly a great experience to go through listening to why. Incidentally, my gas pressures at the end of the 45 minutes back at 6 meters, I was down at 165 bar in each cylinder. So I didn't lose enough gas weight for it to be an issue in that particular circumstance. And as you say, you'd need to be at the end of the cave using all of your bailout, which you should have contingency there anyhow. So there shouldn't be a dive plan where you say, hey, I'm using all of my bailout on the way out. That would be crazy, right? We wouldn't do that. Interesting. I really, really enjoyed that. And thanks for explaining that. Let's go on a bit. I want to talk some more about CCR Cave. So I think you and Patrick are the two CCR Cave instructors at ProTec.
At the moment, it's just Patrick and I. Mm-hmm. So I imagine there'll be more coming, but at the moment, it is just the two of us.
Yeah, and such an interesting course because, again, I think there's a feeling out there that, I'm cave trained and I've got a fair bit of cave experience, open circuit. I then go and do a CCR course. What am I going to learn on this course as an experienced cave diver and maybe a new rebreather diver? So why is this inherently wrong to dive caves on a rebreather when you haven't done cave CCR? And what would a newly minted CCR diver who's already cave trained learn on that course?
It's a good question, and one that actually pops up quite a lot because, as you know, in different parts of the world, there's different rules about this. Even in the same parts of the world, there's different rules of this depending on the shop you go to. And I think the main thing that people take from the CCR Cave class is that the more complex our diving gets, the more tools involved in the diving, the more it shifts from a basic set of rules and guidelines they need to follow to something more resembling something with an art. There's a bit of an art to this. And a decision as simple as what PO2 am I going to use in this section actually has a whole lot of factors in it. And it may change depending on the specific dive parameters or what the other sections of the dive look like, or depending on if you've had that problem, or you've had a delay here or a delay there. What people take from the CCR Cave class is a better understanding of all of the factors that go into making such a seemingly basic decision. And with that understanding, they're more able to not take that decision lightly, weigh all the factors. And when they say, well, I'm going to do this instead of that, they understand what they're giving up. They understand what they're gaining. And then instead of making a choice without knowing all the consequences, it's a conscious choice. I'm going to do this, which means I'm going to be gaining that. I'm costing myself this. And there really is a lot into all these basic decisions. And you have no idea what you don't know until you learn that you don't know it.
Spot on. Yeah, for me, it was such a cool experience. I mean, I knew I wanted to do it. It wasn't a question of wanting to do it. It was more a question of, well, what am I going to learn here? And I knew I'd learn a lot, but it was actually quite staggering to me the things that I did learn. And you mentioned PO2 as one. Let's talk through some of that. I mean, my cave diving on my rebreather before this was pretty much Tank Cave in Australia, which is 10 kilometers of flooded passage. But the furthest reaches of it are about 1,000 meters. So it's not a particularly long cave in any direction. And it's relatively consistent depth-wise at 15 meters average depth in the vast majority of it as well. Some shallower, some not much deeper than that, maybe a little bit. So the main thing I was focused on then was my bailout range and figuring out what distance could I go with what cylinders and making sure I had sufficient bailout to get out. So I'd spend a lot of my time in this cave at 15 meters diving a PO2 of 1.3 because that's what I was taught to do, right? And it wasn't until Patrick said, well, think about your lungs and what you're doing to yourself that I thought, it's a really good point. So talk us through. Usually we dive with a set point, 1.3 or whatever set point you choose, and that's what we try to maintain. Why should we be using a different PO2 in different depths?
Well, the 1.3 thing is very common, and we see it quite a lot. And it does have a lot of validity for certain levels of diving and certain styles of diving. But when your profile more resembles a cave where you may have sections that are 30, 35 meters, and then you have other sections in the same dive which are 6 meters, the needs vary. So if I run a flat set point of 1.3 in the deeper section, and then I run the same set point up in the shallow section, from a fraction of oxygen point of view, I'm going to some very, very high number. I might be breathing something like a nitrox 85 or a 90. And when you put it in that way, most people will say, well, if I was going to go do a dive to 6 meters, I would not default to bringing a nitrox 85 or a nitrox 90. Nobody would do that. We can see it as just excess use of oxygen, but as you said, it is actually costing us something in terms of lung function and oxygen exposure. And if I'm not gaining anything from the increased oxygen, there's no need to expose myself to that and rack up exposure, which then prevents me or uses up some exposure that I could be using in a different part of the dive.
Yes, super interesting. And I'm certainly going to completely change the way that I manage my PO2 based on what I learned there. That was one of the big things. The other thing from a planning perspective was planning for deco. And so that in a cave is really interesting as well, because again, you've got multi-levels. You've got to think about the deco that you occur going into the cave. But then there's aspects of during your exit, you're going to be decompressing during some parts of the exit, on-gassing again during some parts of the exit. And so managing that, and also, I guess if you have an absolute planned dive, you can figure that out reasonably easily. But when you're perhaps exploring or doing something which is a little more complex than that, then maybe not. So let's talk through decompression for a minute in terms of cave diving on a rebreather.
Well, as you said, when you know the profile, it's a little bit easier. When you are unaware of what's coming from the, for instance, exploration style, where you don't really know what's coming, you can kind of get a guess for the cave, the area, etc. But the reality is you don't know what's coming, and you need to have a max plan. You say, okay, I have enough gas for X amount of deco. But something that you would have done in Mod 2 is looking at ratios and saying, okay, for this amount of time, I get this much deco. And having a few milestones in your head at this depth, it's, I do 1 minute, I get 1 minute of deco. You can, on the fly, get a pretty good sense for how much deco 5 minutes is going to cost you here, or 10 minutes is going to cost you here. Or if I spend an hour extra here, I'm going to end up with 20 minutes more deco. Particularly with a lot more experience, as with anything, you can really be quite accurate with it without having to use software. Obviously, we can't do that underwater. And just by having a few points in your head, you can get a pretty good idea. And then there's all the other factors of if I have to exit in open circuit, or if I have to exit, in your case, you decided to go open circuit, but if you exit with semi-close, that's also going to have a pretty drastic impact, or it can have a pretty drastic impact on your decompression. Factoring in all of those things also takes a bit of experience. Actually, I just did this in the Cape today with my class, and we had quite a long discussion about, well, if we had chosen this route, what would have been the outcome? Or if we had chosen this route, what would have been the outcome? There's actually quite a lot to it, but with proper planning experience, you can be pretty accurate.
Yeah, so I really enjoyed it. The other thing that was really important to me was I did my initial cave course in 2013. So that was my intro to cave, along with my side mount training. And then I completed full cave in 2015 or 16. Can't remember now, but it was a while ago. And I'm not a guy like many, many people who live in a cave region. So I don't get to dive caves all the time. I've been building up through our trips to Australia. So we're doing a lot more cave diving than we used to. And I've done trips to Sardinia and Florida. And certainly I've been able to do some cave diving. But the interesting thing for me is for the irregular cave diver, or what I call the holiday cave diver, who after their course practices blindfolded gas sharing through restrictions. I mean, you just don't do that. And I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. We absolutely should. But unless you're teaching, nobody does that. Well, maybe some people do, I don't know, but certainly I didn't. And I felt as if it was time for me to refresh my cave skills alongside learning to dive my rebreather. And I felt like there were two aspects to that. Firstly, I needed the refresh anyhow, so it was good to do that. But secondly, some of the very specific techniques that you use at ProTec were different to what I had before. And I really enjoyed learning some of that. And I'm not sure whether I learned it but forgot it. Putting your hand on the line. I've got my hand up now with my thumb sticking out. Yeah. But with your hand on the line with your thumb pointing in the direction of the exit. So whenever you have to stop and hold the line, you're holding it either with your hand turned one way for your thumb in one direction, or your hand turned the other way for your thumb in the other direction. So should you get disoriented through being distracted or having to do something else, then your thumb is telling you which way is out. I mean, Patrick had, and I'm sure you have the same way, very, very detailed and intricate ways of reading tie-offs, managing your buddy in a gas sharing situation, moving them backwards with your hand, moving them forwards, passing over the tie-off, moving forward, waiting for them. It was an amazing experience from the point of view of refreshing my cave skills, at the same time applying it to a rebreather. So having all of the rebreather failures that, of course, you can have, bailing out, knowing that if you don't have a redundant gas supply with your buddy when you're exiting the cave, then you have to bail out as well, which he let me not do that once and then came back and tried to tear my loop out of my mouth. So that was quite a good fight underwater. You learn these things. And also the other thing that Patrick was quite good at, I'm sure you do it too, was he'd lay navigation traps for me, both of which got me. So that's a bit disappointing, but I guess that's the reason, is you get to learn. And I certainly wasn't expecting to have another jump spool on our exit, which had my cookie on it. That was a little unfair, but it was teaching me a lesson, because I could have reached forward and felt a tie off that would have told me it wasn't our jump. So that was really good. And again, teaching you the importance of navigation when you're stressed, and navigation when you're in zero visibility, and perhaps stressed through other things as well. For me, it was that refresh of cave skills plus applying the rebreather and learning all of the aspects of that was amazing.
What you said with the navigation traps and the different experiences, I came to ProTec as a student, so I had the exact same experiences. And while some of it, I mean, the reality is your cookie is not going to end up on somebody else's line, obviously. But what is so important that I think people can take from that is that there is all of this other information available to us. And the point of that is so that we don't just blindly rely on, well, I'm going to exit and then I'm going to find my cookie and I'm going to go that direction, which 99.9% of the time will completely bring you out. But there is so much other information. As you said, how far is the tie off? What does the line feel like? Where was my spool in what direction did it come from? Were there other spools around? What were the tie offs on the actual line that I'm coming from? Did I pass a halo climb? Was it on a steep slope? Was it on a downward slope? There's just so much information that is easy to just ignore or not realize is available for the taking and processing. And those kind of exercises are really good for that.
Yeah, it was amazing. And of course, you know, a lot of the diving I do in caves, the navigation tank is reasonably complex, but very different because there's a lot of T's in there. We're laying a lot of cookies and not doing, there's still a bunch of jumps in there as well. But what I found in Mexico, and I know this has been a factor in many, many accidents and fatalities, is getting the navigation wrong is, you know, you've really got to concentrate because it can be complex. We did our dive with Maria. We did 5 jumps in that dive. Having come off the course, reading every jump spool, every tie off, you know, what is around the jump spool? How is it positioned? How many tie offs are there close to that? What's next? So it really woke me up to a lot of that. And again, it was a really, really stellar experience in that respect.
I'm glad to hear that.
Cool. So I'm going to change gears a bit now. I know you've been away recently doing some dry caving. I think it was in France. And I've seen you diving with Skander and Patrick and Philip Lehman and others in terms of your own exploration projects. Obviously, you're working at ProTec, and so a lot of the time is spent teaching cave CCR, cave courses, and so on. But tell us about the diving that you're doing outside of that. What do you do when you get a chance to go diving?
So right from the beginning, the whole idea of experience being king has been a big factor, and going and doing diving on your own is obviously the only way to really get that. Exploration was not something that was ever really on my mind. I've always been a teacher first. It's the only job I've ever had, and I'm a teacher at heart, really. But it's hard once you get a taste of the exploration to not instantly understand why people dedicate their lives to it. So as soon as I had that moment of, oh, wow, this is a really cool experience, then I tried to spend as much time as I could doing it. And for several years, I had quite a lot of time. So Skanda was my main exploration buddy on a day-to-day basis. I've done a few projects with Patrick, a little bit of diving with Philip, although not as much as I hope to come in the future. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, the last 2 years or so, basically since the Sidewinder came to ProTec, my time for exploration has been limited, to say the least. However, fortunately, there's enough projects within the team that when I do have a bit of time, we can go and jump in on these. The bigger ones in the last few years have been working on the Blue Abyss with Patrick and Skanda, which unfortunately didn't really pan out into a whole new section of cave, but it was a really cool project.
It was super deep as well?
Yeah, I don't remember the exact number, but it's 110, maybe 115 at the max. I had done deep diving, I had done long range diving, I had done small cave diving, tank off and no mount restrictions. That was the first time where I actually combined all three of them into one project. Mm-hmm. I was quite glad that the first time, or the beginning of the project, was very progressive penetration. I went down and Patrick went and actually did the deep side of the cave. I just went down, did a little bit of filming. That was enough for me that day. Mm-hmm. It was also the first time I had an oxygen internal boom, which was 60 some meters. And then over the course of several dives, I got to go a little bit further, a little bit further, a little bit further. And then when Patrick was traveling, Scan and I had a week and a half or so, and we really sunk our teeth into that one. Did a full resurvey of everything, laid a little bit of line, but not as much as we had hoped going in, to be perfectly honest. Although I don't really know if it's possible to lay as much line as you hoped. You always hope for some infinite amount, but it was a good experience nonetheless.
Until you run out of line, I guess, they're the good days, aren't they?
Yeah. But we've had a few other really awesome projects. My favorite one, which is my first real project that I got to work on, was the Regina project with Patrick. Mm-hmm. And that was something that we actually had very little hope for. It was just, while he was teaching, he had seen a little hole. And then it just turned out to be several kilometers of incredibly awesome cave. And while it was not my first exploration, that was the first real taste of a project that just keeps on giving and giving and giving. And that was where I think I really had drunk the exploration Kool-Aid, if you will.
And how do you see the dry caving playing into what you're doing? Because there's not a lot of dry caves, at least in the Yucatan area, is there?
Well, there are some people doing it, but not a vast quantity in this area, no. There's little sections here and there. The dry caving thing is, at the moment for me, just something that I can learn. I'm a complete novice at it. And it's actually really nice to go and just be a complete novice. I made some really basic, somewhat embarrassing mistakes, and I can do that in dry caving, which is great. Because I'm not doing anything extreme. I'm not responsible for other people. So I've really been enjoying it. How it's going to play into exploration is something that the future is hopefully determined. Although Patrick is already working on several dry caving projects that I haven't had a chance to go and join yet, but that day will come soon.
And of course, he describes himself as an alpinist. Certainly that's what he did before he was even diving in Austria, right? So joining those two things together would be amazing. And he took me through a little bit of his project before I turned up. Is it Chapas? Have I got that right?
Yep.
Yeah, it sounds brilliant. Incredibly remote and challenging, but still, I'm sure it's quite rewarding when you make some progress. So let's take a moment and talk about my Mod 2 class, because we focused on CCR Cave because I know you're the CCR Cave instructor. Are you a Mod 2 instructor yet or working towards that?
Wrapping it up.
Yeah, because that also was a really special experience. And I think we did it the right way around from my point of view too, doing the Mod 2 first. We did our initial checkout dives and no fins practice before the Mod 2. And I think the way things are going with the Sidewinder right now too, we went right back to the beginning and redid all of the Sidewinder skills because they were quite different to what I did on my Mod 1 course with Ed. But I thoroughly enjoyed that too. I like the timeout, bailout idea or concept. And certainly it was good for me when I eventually did bail out. I bailed out about 100 times before I hadn't got to my real one in the cave. But what came out of the Mod 2 course, I think the first things were going through all the skills again and really working on those. You mentioned you had an O2 internal boom. So going through practicing that and the specific steps in each skill, which I was practicing in my room each night and pretty much nailed that in the end. I think that went quite well for me. The things that were somewhat surprising was the ratio deco. And coming from New Zealand here with Professor Simon Mitchell, who's spent a lot of time talking about why ratio deco isn't a good idea. And I think we're going to plant the wrong seed here too, because I think he's looking at a very specific method of ratio deco, which isn't the strategy that you guys are using. And what was quite remarkable to me, I mean, it does come with some caveats. We were on a very specific gradient factors and we had a ratio at 45 meters, which was the point at which your bottom time, according to Deco Planner, was the same as your decompression. So that's kind of your starting point. But what was surprising was when we ran all the different permutations for Mod 2 dives, 60 meters up to about 20 minutes, the 1-to-1 ratio held pretty well. We weren't going any deeper, but if we went any longer, then we could add a different ratio to that. So we could do 1.5 minutes for every minute of bottom time or 2 minutes. And again, we were able to on the fly come up with a strategy. And I think the only thing you have to get really good at is calculating 60% of a number. That was always the challenge, is 60% of a round 10 number is pretty easy, but coming up with 60% of another number wasn't so much. And I was very quiet in the room because I'm actually an engineer, so I've got the equivalent of a mathematics degree. So I was reasonably good at it, but I'm usually more comfortable with a calculator doing something complex than something as simple as in your head doing 60% of 55 or whatever. But there's some easy strategies for that. And as I said, what was shocking was how simple it was and how close to running Bulman gradient factors 50-85 against this ratio. We were pretty much within a minute or two, both at 6 meters and also in the 21 meter to 6 meter range as well. Talk me through from your perspective. I'm sure this was something relatively new to you as well in working at ProTec. So how does that work in your mind and why is it so valuable?
It was completely new when I came here. I had learned pretty much just you plan on your software, you print out a table and you stick to that table. Particularly sticking to all the runtimes always really stressed me out. But as you said, the ratios, they're not a deco planning system. They come from the algorithms themselves. They come from the software. And more than anything, it's just a way to get a really quite accurate estimate on the fly of how much deco you're going to need to do, which also allows you a little bit of flexibility. And okay, if I stay here for another X amount of time, I'm going to be owing this much deco. I may be able to account for that in my gas and my plan, or maybe I cannot. And more often than not, it really turns out quite accurate. While I'm not going to ignore my computer altogether, I'm going to do the deco that my computer says. They're really quite aligned majority of the time, but it gives a better ability to on the fly go, okay, my deco should look like this, which also catches, while uncommon, but if there is some error in the gas you put into your computer or the decompression gases that are in your computer, if you look at your computer and just kind of blindly follow it, you're just going to follow it and you're not going to catch that, oh, there was something wrong here. Whereas if you have a pretty good understanding, you can look at that and go, that should look different. Maybe something's wrong, and then identify where the problem lies. Yeah,
100%. I'd put it under the term of thinking diver. You're not blindly following a computer that is only as good as its programming and only as good as the information or the data that you've entered into it. So if you've made a mistake, you're quite right, then it's going to be wrong. And of course, we all know that decompression, it's as much an art as a science. And on any given day, the deco that your computer tells you may or may not be the right amount of deco for you. So following it blindly to the second or the minute, or worrying about 1 minute this way, 1 minute that way, is really not the right way to look at decompression. You know, the idea is to look at it and say, hey, yeah, I've done a certain dive. I need to do a certain amount of deco, and don't be afraid to do more in the shallows, by the way, either, because that's always going to be better, right? I just thought it was excellent. The things that I struggled with, we were running stopwatches. So the discipline of remembering to press the button, especially when you had other things going on. And the other thing that shouldn't have been surprising to me, but caught me out a couple of times, was when I had to do another specific task. So for instance, launch an SMB and watching my PPO2 while I was doing that. And we had one dive there where it dropped down to under 0.5 for a while. It wasn't unsafe for me, but what it meant was that I was incurring a lot more decompression. And so as a result of that error on my part, we ended up spending another 10 minutes at 6 meters. But the bottom line was it does rely on you managing your PO2 and being on the ball. And so, again, these are the lessons you learn on a course, so hopefully you'll apply them when you do your diving. Again, I keep coming back to the skills and the structure that's built around that for the Sidewinder now. I was really, really happy to see how structured each one is, how the timeout takes care of most things, not the internal booms. You've definitely got to deal with those in a different way. Let's take you back to your O2 internal boom. How did that go for you?
I learned quite a lot from that, actually. And most of it, honestly, is looking back and just realizing I had made this mistake and this mistake and that mistake. And the beauty of the timeout is that it just works, and it doesn't require any forethought as to, okay, this is happening, and that means I need to do drill 4. So that's this step. It's just, okay, there's a problem, take a timeout, bail out, and then you have a chance. On that particular day, I had made a planning error, which looking back feels very easy to just go, yeah, that was a mistake. But at the same time, it's very easy to just go, well, it's not going to happen in this particular moment. That would have to be really unlucky, and then just plan for that. So what I had done is my dive was a very, very short stint at the bottom. I was going to go down, take a video of Patrick going through the restriction, and then I was going to go back up to the shallows and work on survey with Skanda and the rest of the team. So I didn't particularly want to be swimming around at 5 meters with gas that is designed for 60 to 70 meters. So I had my left and my right side mount tank as shallow, the standard gas we use in the shallows, Nitrox 32. And then I had an extra tank of deep gas for me. And I had said, okay, if for whatever reason I need to bail out, I'm going to go to that tank. And looking back, you have now come through the class, it goes against everything that we really say, is that when push comes to shove, you are going to default to A, what you've practiced, and B, the simplest answer. So in the case of the internal boom, I had a bit of a moment of panic as to, wow, I had one job. I'm supposed to be here recording. So I just had to put the GoPro and the light away and then let all this gas out. I closed my oxygen and the gas stopped. And as you know, the next step would be flushing all that gas out. But at the moment, with percolation raining down on me, because the bottom of the Blue Abyss is not a particularly friendly spot, I just like, okay, you know what? I'm going open circuit. And I close my loop. I grab my short hose, which is the one that we default to bailing out to. And I held it in front of my face for a second. And I thought, this is actually not the gas for me right now. And I sat there thinking, not in a moment of like freezing. I just was thinking, okay, this is not the gas for me. Okay, I'm going to open the loop and just flush everything out. And Patrick had actually gone through the restriction, turned around, and he had told me before the dive, once I go through the restriction, I cannot fly back through it and help you. So do not get into trouble in the minute or two between me going through the restriction and you reconvening with Skanda. And of course, that's exactly what happened. And he turned around and he watched me with no loop in my mouth, holding a regulator in front of my face and not putting it in my mouth, just sitting there thinking. And as you know, as someone who teaches and as we see in class, when someone's sitting there thinking, you have no real way of knowing what's going on in that person's brain. And I generally give people a rule that you have 4 to 5 seconds max to put something in your mouth before I'm putting something in your mouth. And I took much longer than that 5 seconds. So I imagine he was not super thrilled by that. But I learned that day that even as a professional who felt like that was a totally manageable thing, when it actually happened and O2 was flooding through my rebreather and all of this, I reverted back to what I have done 1,000 times before. And I do not change that anymore.
Yeah, I'm kind of reflecting in my mind on my last episode with Stephen Fordyce where he had the laryngospasm and he was in a very, very difficult situation there. And it was only muscle memory that got him through it and a couple of smart decisions, purging his regulator and so on. And as you rightly point out, if you're relying on something that is other than your tried and proven muscle memory way of doing something, then if the shit really hits the fan, if something is really, really more complicated or just a little bit more complicated, then you potentially will struggle. And it's a really good message, I think. And obviously that will stay with you. And here's the thing, I think it's great to reflect on when things go right and wrong. So my bailout due to a computer failure is about the simplest thing that can go wrong because you've got a little bit of time. Your PPO2 isn't going to change. I'm not changing depths. And my rebreather is still operating. So the rebreather itself is not the problem. It's my method of knowing my PO2. And so I bailed out, but on reflection of what I did, and I communicated with Steve, and so Steve knew what was going on, but I could have done that so much better. And I reflected afterwards on what I should have done. I mean, I could have super chilled out, swam up to Steve, indicated I had something wrong, pointed at my computer, said it was broken, told him I was going to bail out, and just gone through step by step. Now I'm going to bail out. You watch me bail out, let him know, hey, I'm okay. We call the dive. Let's go. And I know my other buddy in the team, Mark, as we were leaving the cave, didn't really know what the problem was. He knew that we were exiting, but he didn't really know why. And I had way enough time to be able to, with a team, face them and explain to them exactly what was going on and do my bailout with the safety of having my guide and my other buddy observing me. What I actually did was I went up to Steve. I signaled that I had an issue. I pointed to my computer, told him it was broken. And then I called the dive, turned and bailed out, swimming out of the cave without him watching me. Was that a problem?
Right.
No, it was all okay. But I missed some pretty important steps that would have made that a much, much better exercise or evolution on my part in terms of making sure my team were aware of what's going on. And also, let's say I had your problem, or let's say I had another problem I had with Patrick one time where my long hose and short hose got tangled up while I was trying to bail out. And I can't remember exactly the drill we were doing. Patrick came and helped me, but I actually didn't need his help. It's like you, it was like 3 or 4 seconds. He was giving me the time, 3 seconds elapsed. That was it. He came and helped and I was just about to get it. And I thought, I didn't really need the help, but at the same time, I knew what was going through his head. So had I had another issue, I missed the opportunity of having my team support me. So on reflection, I thought, okay, I did it this way. Wouldn't it have been better if I went boom, 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 boom? And this will stay with me for the next time I have an issue. I hopefully will handle it a little bit better than that one. And I think that constant improvement and constant reflection on what goes right and what doesn't go right is a really good way to think about your diving.
Absolutely. And I think anyone who has had any sort of issues in the cave or in any diving circumstance will look back. And if they actually reflect on it, will go, well, I did this part well, but that part I could have done better. And I think the most important thing is that we actually do that reflection, because if we don't do the reflection, we don't learn the lesson. And if I do a mistake once, I'm like, okay, great. But if that same mistake happens again, I say, okay, Jake, come on. You've done this twice now. And not only doing that reflection for ourselves, but sharing that experience with people and being open to the fact that, yes, we do make mistakes. And I remember at the beginning, when I first started teaching, I was a bit hesitant to share my own mistakes because you want to show the presence of professionalism and role model, et cetera, et cetera. But the reality is, of course, everybody makes mistakes. And the more extreme your diving is, the more advanced your diving is, the more likelihood that you make several mistakes. And they may not be fundamental mistakes, but they could be more nuanced things like I could have done this better, or I could have communicated that more clearly. And I think sharing those has tons of value, and just accepting the fact that we all make these mistakes. And the more we talk about them, the better overall we will be in terms of acceptance of mistakes and safety.
Totally. And much of it's ego and much of it is, as you say, this professionalism and I want to be seen to be better than that. But of course, none of us are. We're all human. And Gareth Locke, I'm sure you're aware of Gareth, his entire business, Human Factors, is built around this principle of learning from mistakes and also sharing them. I think there was a post on Facebook I saw by him today, which was very much that. Dive professionals need to share their mistakes. We're doing this now, both of us, from the point of view that we make mistakes and also we can learn from our own and we can share them with others so that they potentially won't make the same mistake. And so that's positive for the entire dive community. And I think in a way it just shows that we're growing up and putting ego to some degree to one side and saying that it's okay. And of course, Stratus Cuss's book, Close Calls, there's much of this going on now, which I think is awesome. When you told me about the internal boom, I thought, I've practiced that so much now. I want to find out how it went for you. So brilliant.
Well, I can tell you that it did not go very well.
That's okay. I turned up saying, what's an internal boom? So that's kind of where I was at. And again, it was just not so much any disrespect to what had happened to me before, but we just had some differences around the way that things were managed. So bringing some standardization to this now and having a defined set of skills done in a particular way, I think is a good thing for us. And of course, there can be some discussion and maybe room for variances based on the type of diving or even to some degree instructors. But I got a lot out of that. And I made the comment in my last episode, this is what you want from training, right? You want to turn up and go, I'm a vastly better diver than when I turned up.
Yeah.
And that is absolutely the case. And so I was extremely pleased to go through that. And again, my objective for Cave CCR was back to why wouldn't I do some more training to make me safer? I relate this to my family every time they find out how much I spent on it was, well, that's money spent on making sure that I come home from these dives. How can you put a value on that? Mate, I don't have too much more for you. I want to know how much you guys are missing me and whether anyone's commented on where's Steve and when's he coming back.
I talked to Steve actually about the day that you guys went, and he said it was fun. And I saw that you guys actually got to dive with Brian Kaycook that joined you guys for a day.
That was such an experience because I've interviewed Brian twice on Speaking Sidemount. He's such a nice guy. He's part of Sidemount and cave diving history as well. So such an amazing guy. He's basically opened up the caves of the Bahamas and is now the guardian of them, which is pretty cool as well. I saw a post he put on Facebook, and so I just messaged him and said, hey, I'm in town. Let me know if you can catch up for dinner or something, not expecting that we could dive. And he'd been diving with Jill Hyneth and working on her video project, which also is pretty cool. And then Brian just reached out to me and said, hey, I've got a day free. I'd love to go diving. And I said, oh, do you want to come with us? And he said, well, will you have me? And I went, well, yeah, of course. So I ran out and had to wait in line to talk to Kim behind 15 other divers who were trying to chat to Kim that day. But I mean, I don't know the lay of the land with you guys. And I said, listen, Brian wants to come. Of course, he was welcomed with open arms. And then he turned up, and such a humble guy. He was just part of our team and hung out. And then we planned our dive with Steve at Taj Mahal and then went for a dive. We went out to the Chinese garden and to the waterfall. Yeah. And then Brian had done quite a bit of diving the next few days. So he sat out for the next part, and Steve and I went in and had a look at the bone room, I think it's called as well. Yep. So, it was just such a pleasure to meet him in person, dive with him, and spend a bit of time. And then, of course, to have some video with us in the cave together as well was brilliant too. So I haven't had the chance to go to the Bahamas, but that's way on my list.
I actually went in January. A friend of mine said, I'm going to the Bahamas. Do you want to come? And I was absolutely. So I went down and I spent 5 or 6 days diving with Brian, and the diving was amazing. But by far, the part that I thought was so interesting was he's just a part of the diving and particularly Sidemount diving history. And I had to mentally balance how many questions can I ask him without annoying him. And every time I asked a question, he was amazing about answering, which I'm sure he's answered 100 times, but always gave me such good answers. I was in the middle of writing some training materials and I had specific questions for him, and he gave me very specific answers. He pulled harnesses off the wall. Well, I did this change and then this guy did that change. Pulled out the photo albums, showed me some hardcover books that I could read quite quickly. That was by far the part that I remember most.
The Abaco in itself is great, but that's diving. I mean, on this particular trip, so I met you, I met Patrick. Again, know these people. We're Facebook friends, of course, because we're all Facebook friends with each other. But then to meet you, to meet Skanda in the end as well, I thought I was going to miss him. Didn't get to dive with him, which was pretty disappointing, but I told him he's off my Christmas card list, but he was on his way to India ostensibly, so that was a pretty good reason. But to spend time with Patrick, to meet Kim, to dive with Steve and Maria, and then all the other people as well. I caught up with Alessandra Figari for dinner and her partner Peter. That was brilliant. Met Jill Heineth, met Natalie Gibb, David Mayer, Maria Bollerup, Rasmus, Tristan Termut as well. Just a staggering experience. I can't wait, plan for what we're doing here in New Zealand now. We've got some very, very good divers here who are all shipwreck divers and rebreather divers and so on. So we're taking them to Australia and we're doing training through the CDAA there to bring them up to a level that I think we can come to Mexico. And once we get them to kind of the equivalent of intro to cave and full cave, we'll come. And I was talking to Kim about the potential to do a workshop for everyone on arrival because they will have been diving Australian caves. So we do a Mexico cave workshop. Here's what's different about Mexico. And then go and do some guided diving with you guys will be just amazing. So I'm excited to start looking at that. I'm hoping we can start at 2024. I think might be the first opportunity. I've got to figure whether I can try and get back myself before then. But from me to all of you, pass it on to everybody. Thank you for hosting me. Thank you for a great experience. And I just can't emphasize enough how great it is diving in Mexico. And the people at ProTec are right at the very top of the professionalism index as well. So I love my time. And again, thank you. And thank you for joining me and giving me time as well. I know you just got back from teaching a course this afternoon. It's never a dull moment for you guys, right?
Thank you for having me. It was really quite a pleasure. I've listened to the podcast over the last however long, and it's pretty cool to actually be a part of it. I'm a bit sad that I didn't actually get a chance to come with you guys. I was supposed to join you for one of the classes, and it just didn't work out. But next time.
Yeah, so I'm going to hold you guys to that as well, and I think we should go and do something super cool. I can't wait to come and do some dives with you and Skander and perhaps some of the others as well, see if we can drag Philip in to do something.
Let's do it.
Yeah, can't wait. Thank you, mate, and thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did catching up with Jake. It was amazing to be able to talk through the Cave CCR course and also the Mod 2 course with him and share my experiences along with hearing from him exactly why some of the specifics of that course are taught the way that they are at ProTec. It was a real eye-opener for me both on the course and also hearing Jake expand on some of the very specific aspects such as no fins training, cave CCR aspects, especially calculating deco and cave profiles, and also what we did on the Mod 2 course. Thanks again to XDEEP for their support of this show, and also to the patrons of Speaking Sidemount. Thanks so much for supporting me. It really makes a difference to this show. Thanks again, and I'll catch you all on the next episode. You've been listening to Speaking Sidemount from www.sidemountpros.com. If you like the podcast, please subscribe and consider leaving us a 5-star review. If there's something you'd like us to cover on the show, then let us know via our Facebook page listed in the podcast notes. Thanks again, and we look forward to you joining us on our next episode of Speaking Sidemount.